The April monsoon lashed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Gangnam penthouse, blurring the neon sprawl of Seoul into a jagged smear of electric blue and violent violet. High above the rain-slicked misery of the city, the air inside the residence was still and heavy, pressurized by the wealth of men who moved markets with a whisper. Warm light from recessed architectural fixtures spilled over polished obsidian floors and minimalist silk wall coverings, creating an island of sterile opulence that felt entirely disconnected from the thundering sky outside. The low, rhythmic hum of a hidden ventilation system masked the soft clink of silver against bone china. Grace moved through the dining room with the practiced, soundless grace of someone who had spent 7 years learning how not to exist. The scent of seared wagyu and expensive truffle oil clung to her skin, a sharp contrast to the faint, comforting smell of cocoa butter and laundry detergent that always followed her home to Lila. Her lower back throbbed from 10 hours of standing, a dull ache that she buried beneath a mask of professional neutrality. At 31, Grace had mastered the alchemy of the domestic worker. She was a shadow that cleared plates, a ghost that anticipated the need for more wine, an invisible force that kept the world of the elite spinning without ever leaving a fingerprint. It was a survival mechanism. To be efficient was to be safe. To be unnoticed was to be employed. Tonight, the silence in the penthouse felt brittle, like ice about crack. Grace felt the hairs on her neck rise, a primal instinct honed by years of navigating spaces where she was tolerated but never truly welcome. As she moved to adjust the placement of a heavy crystal carafe, her eyes drifted toward the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains where 5-year-old Lila sat on a low stool, her pink dress a small, bright bloom against the dark fabric. Lila wasn't coloring. Her wide, expressive eyes were fixed on the head of the table, her small mouth parted in a silent gasp of dawning terror. That's when Grace felt the atmospheric pressure drop. Han Taesung entered the dining room, and the air seemed to vacate the lungs of every man present. At 32, he moved with the economical lethality of a panther, every step deliberate, his posture radiating a high-status gravity that demanded total submission. His jet-black hair was swept back into a sharp pompadour, and the dark ink of a dragon's tail curled menacingly above his crisp white collar. He didn't look at the men standing to greet him. His gaze was fixed on his seat, intense and concentrated. He was a man accustomed to being the hunter, a predator in a bespoke black suit and a wine-red tie. He sat down, oblivious to the fact that for the first time in his life, the most important person in the room wasn't him. It was a little girl in the shadows who had seen the polished man to his right move far too quickly over his plate. Before we continue, please comment, and subscribe for more gripping stories of power, survival, unforgettable transformations, gripping Mafia stories, power reversal, and justice-driven. The alarm on Grace's phone buzzed at 4:30 a.m., a lonely sound in the quiet dark of her small apartment. Outside, the Seoul streets were still gray, but Grace was already moving. She dressed quickly, her muscles stiff from the day before, and pressed a soft kiss on Lila's forehead. Her daughter was a mess of beautiful dark curls against a white pillow, still deep in the dreams of a 5-year-old. Grace couldn't stay to see her wake up. She had to be a ghost in the penthouse before the sun even touched the skyscrapers. By 6 a.m., Grace was in the vast, modern kitchen of the Han estate. She moved with a silence that was almost magical. She poached eggs of perfection and arranged slices of fruit with the precision of an artist. When the family finally emerged, they spoke over her as if she were a piece of the expensive furniture. "Your English is so good," a guest had told her once, smiling with a kindness that felt like a sting. "Where are you really from?" Grace would just smile and nod, offering more coffee. To them, she was a helpful shadow from a faraway place, someone to be praised for her service but never truly known. Being invisible was a skill she had learned out of necessity. In the quiet moments, her mind drifted back to Ghana, to the red dust of the roads and the heat of the afternoon sun. She remembered the day the doctor spoke the words that changed everything. Her mother's heart was failing. The treatment cost more than Grace could earn in a lifetime back home. So she packed her life into a single suitcase, promised her mother she would send the money, and flew across the world. In Korea, she was grateful for scraps and the extra hours, even if it meant her pride was slowly being worn away. In the afternoon, the cold wind bit her face as she waited outside the crowded after-school program. She stood apart from the other mothers. They were elegant Korean women in long coats, chatting easily about piano lessons and weekend trips. Grace watched them, noticing how they never seemed to calculate the price of a bus fare or the cost of a liter of milk. They belonged here. They weren't afraid of a wrong turn or a lost visa. Grace felt a deep, quiet longing for that kind of simple dignity, to walk through the world without feeling like she had to apologize for taking up space. "Mama!" Lila shouted, bursting through the doors and jumping into Grace's arms. As they walked to the bus stop, Lila looked up with wide, curious eyes. "Mama, why do the ladies at the store look at us different? And why do you stay so quiet when the mister speaks mean?" The questions were like tiny cracks in the wall Grace had built around her heart. She didn't want Lila to learn the art of being invisible. She wanted her daughter to stand tall, even if the world tried to make her feel small. That night, back in their room, Grace sat at the small wooden table. She pulled out a hidden envelope and counted the ones she had saved. It was never enough. Between the rent, the food, and the heavy cost of her mother's medicine, the pile of bills grew so slowly. But then she looked at Lila, who was busy drawing a picture of a princess in a pink dress. Grace straightened her back. She would be a shadow for another 10 years if it meant Lila could one day walk in the light. She didn't know that in just a few hours, at a dinner filled with dangerous men, her daughter's voice would shatter her quiet world forever. The room froze the moment Lila's high, clear voice stopped ringing. Han Taesung did not move for a long heartbeat. His dark eyes remained fixed on his bowl of soup, his thick brows furrowing as if he were solving a difficult puzzle. Then, with a sudden, sharp movement, he grabbed a silver spoon and dipped it into the liquid. He didn't eat it. Instead, he signaled to a man standing near the wall with a medical kit. The test was quick and silent. When the man looked up, his face was pale. "Cyanide, boss," he whispered, enough to stop a heart in minutes. A chair scraped harshly against the floor. Ji-hoon, the man who had been smiling just moments before, was already gone, slipping out through a side door in confusion. Immediately, the penthouse went into lockdown. Heavy metal shutters hissed as they covered the windows, and the sound of clicking locks echoed through the halls. Grace felt the air leave her lungs. She pulled Lila behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was terrified. In her mind, she could already see the police arriving in the handcuffs, and the cold room where they would tell her she was being sent back to Ghana for a crime she didn't commit. For the first time since she had started working here, Taesung truly looked at her. He didn't look over her shoulder or through her. He saw the sweat on her forehead and the way her hands shook as she gripped her daughter's shoulders. He saw her fear, but he also saw Lila's confusion. To Lila, she had just been a good girl who shared a secret. She didn't understand why the mister looked so angry or why the guards were shouting. Taesung stood up and walked toward them. He was a mountain of man, his black suit perfectly tailored and his neck tattooed dark against the skin. Grace flinched, expecting a shout, but Taesung did something she never expected. He slowly knelt down until he was at Lila's height. The powerful Mafia boss, covered in ink and fear by the city, looked directly into the little girl's eyes. "You saved my life, little one," he said. His voice was low and gravelly, but surprisingly gentle. "I am a man who does not forget his debts." He turned his gaze to Grace, his expression turning serious again. "You and your daughter are under my protection now. That means no one touches you. Do you understand?" Grace opened her mouth to refuse. Her pride screamed at her to take Lila and run, to go back to their small apartment and hide from this dangerous world. But before she could speak, Taesung's phone buzzed. He listened for a second, then showed Grace a tablet. Her heart stopped. On the screen, grainy security footage showed dark cars pulling up to her apartment building in Queens. Men were already searching the hallway near her door. "They are looking for the witness," Taesung said firmly. "If you go back there, you will not survive the night." The reality hit Grace like a physical blow. Her maternal instinct finally drowned out her pride. She couldn't protect Lila in a world of assassins and poison. Suddenly, Lila reached out and placed a small, warm hand on Taesung's tattooed fingers. "He has pretty drawings, Mama," Lila whispered, smiling up at the man everyone else called a monster. Grace looked at her daughter's trusting face and realized Lila saw something she didn't. She saw a protector where Grace saw a predator. With a heavy sigh, Grace reached out and took the hand Taesung offered, stepping forever out of the shadows and into his light. The sleek black car moved silently through the winding, narrow streets of Bukchon Hanok village. When it stopped, the world felt completely different. Taesung led them into a hidden, traditional Korean house. It was a place of quiet beauty, with dark wooden beams and sliding doors made of delicate hanji paper. In the center was a small courtyard garden where a single persimmon tree stood, its orange fruit glowing like lanterns in the moonlight. For the first time in years, Grace was given her own room. It was a private space, clean and calm, but she could not find any rest. The beauty of the house only made the danger feel more real. Every time a wooden floorboard creaked or the wind rattled the paper doors, Grace jumped. She knew Taesung's guards were patrolling the stone walls outside, their shadows moving past the windows, but she still felt like a target. At night, she pulled Lila close, holding her tight against her chest. To drown out the sound of her own racing heart, she sang soft Ghanaian lullabies. The familiar songs about the rolling hills and the stars over Kra were the only things that kept the terror away. The first few days were filled with a heavy, awkward silence. When they sat down for meals, the clatter of chopsticks was the only sound in the room. Grace didn't know how to talk to a man who ruled a criminal empire, and Taesung seemed like a man who had forgotten how to talk to anyone at all. He ate quickly, his eyes always scanning the room, his face like a mask of stone. He was a protector, but he felt more like a prison guard. Once again, it was Lila who broke the ice. She had no fear of the mister with the dark ink on his skin. One afternoon, while Taesung sat at the low wooden table checking his phone, Lila walked up and pointed to his neck. "Why do you have a dragon?" she asked plainly. Taesung paused, looking surprised that anyone dared to question him. "And that bird," she added, pointing to the phoenix on his hand. "The dragon is for my father," Taesung said, his voice unusually short. "The phoenix is for my mother. They are gone now." Lila nodded as if she understood his pain perfectly. She reached into her small bag and pulled out a box of bright crayons, sliding a blue one toward him. "You should draw with me, mister. It makes the sad go away. My mama says colors are like medicine for the soul." Grace watched from the doorway, her breath catching as she waited for Taesung to grow angry. Instead, he stared at the blue crayon for a long time before slowly picking it up. The turning point came that evening. Grace stood in the shadows of the porch, watching the courtyard. Taesung was sitting on the wooden floor next to Lila. He wasn't drawing, but he was doing something else. With incredible patience, his large, tattooed hands were folding a small square of white paper. His movements were steady and surprisingly gentle. When he finished, a perfect paper crane sat in his palm. He handed it to Lila, a small smile finally cracking his stone-cold expression. In that moment, the mister vanished, and Grace saw a lonely boy who had been forced to grow up too fast. She felt something shift in her heart, a tiny spark of trust she hadn't felt in a long time. She realized that while she was protecting Lila's life, Lila was somehow busy protecting Taesung's soul. Life in the hidden house began to find its own rhythm. To make the wooden kitchen feel like home, Grace started cooking the dishes of her childhood. The scent of spicy jollof rice and sweet, fried kelaweel filled the air. Lila's eyes brightened at the familiar flavors. But Taesung looked at the red rice with a worried expression. He took a small bite, then another, until he was eating with a hunger Grace hadn't seen before. "My mother used to cook like this," he said quietly, his voice thick with memory. "The spices are different, but the feeling is the same. It tastes like love." In return, Taesung took over the kitchen the next night. He prepared kimchi jjigae, a bubbling red stew, and grilled samgyeopsal on a small flame. He sat cross-legged on the floor, patiently teaching Lila how to place the grilled meat inside a crisp lettuce leaf with a dab of sauce. "You have to wrap it like a little present," he explained. Lila giggled, her small fingers messy with sauce, while Grace watched them from across the low table. For a few minutes, the guards outside and the poison in the soup felt like a bad dream from a different life. One afternoon, Grace found Taesung staring at a pile of folders. He looked frustrated, his dark brows pulled tight. Grace had spent years as a shadow in the background of wealthy homes, and she knew that powerful people often forgot that the help had ears. When rich people plot, they treat their staff like furniture, she told him. I have heard things you might find useful. She pointed to a list of names and dates. She remembered a conversation from a month ago, a driver talking to a maid about a secret meeting in a basement. She showed Taesung a pattern his men had missed, a series of phone calls that happened every time he was out of town. Taesung looked at her with a new kind of respect. He realized that Grace was just as observant as he was. Late that night, after Lila had fallen asleep with her paper crane tucked under a pillow, Grace and Taesung sat in the courtyard. The stars were bright over the persimmon tree. Taesung spoke about his past, how his mother was killed when he was only 12, and how his father had forced him into a life of crime. I'm trying to make it all legal, he whispered. I'm trying to get out. Grace shared her own story. The father who left, the crushing poverty in Ghana, and the promise she made to save her mother's life. We are both trying to be more than what the world decided we should be, Grace said, her voice steady. Taesung looked at her, his dark eyes filled with sadness that made her heart ache. The difference is you are succeeding, Grace. You are raising a child who was brave enough to save a stranger. I am still just playing with blood money. As the cool night air brushed against them, Grace realized she was no longer afraid of the man with the dragons on his neck. He wasn't the monster the world saw. He was just a man trying to escape the shadow of his father, just as she was trying to escape the trap of being poor. They were two people from different worlds, but their hearts were fighting the same battle for a better future. The peace of the hidden house was shattered on a Tuesday morning. A black envelope had been left at the stone gate, containing a message from Ji-hoon. The words were cold and clear. Return what you took, and the organization can move forward peacefully. Keep them, and everyone suffers. Grace watched from the window as Taesung's face turned into a mask of stone. She knew what he took meant her and Lila. To the men in Taesung's world, they were not people. They were just pieces of evidence that needed to be erased. As the day went on, the shadows in the courtyard seemed to grow longer. Taesung was constantly on the phone, his voice low and urgent. The conspiracy was much bigger than just one jealous partner. Rival gangs, police officers on the take, and even powerful politicians were all part of the web. Taesung's plan to make his business legal was threatening their secret income. If he succeeded, they would lose millions. To them, a maid and a 6-year-old girl were small obstacles that needed to be cleared away. Grace was walking toward the kitchen when she heard voices coming from Taesung's office. She paused behind the sliding door, her breath catching in her throat. She heard Taesung's second-in-command speaking about eliminating the witnesses to close this matter quietly. The blood drained from Grace's face. In that world, eliminating only meant one thing. Fury exploded inside her, washing away every bit of her usual politeness. She slid the door open with a bang, her eyes blazing. If you even think about touching my daughter, she hissed, her voice trembling with a mother's rage, I will show you what a desperate person is capable of. The room went silent. The guard looked shocked, but Taesung stood up slowly. He stepped toward her, his dark eyes intense. I would burn this entire organization to the ground before I let a single hair on her head be harmed, he interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. He looked at his confused guard, and then back to Grace. Did you really think I meant you? I was talking about eliminating the men who betrayed me. I was talking about Ji-hoon. Grace leaned against the doorframe, her heart still racing. Even though he promised to protect them, her fear remained. How could she truly trust a man whose life was built on violence? In his world, problems were solved with guns and shadows. She looked at his tattooed hands and saw a history of pain that she could never fully understand. Look at this, Grace, Taesung said, pulling her toward his desk. He didn't show her a weapon. Instead, he showed her a laptop filled with documents, bank records, recorded meetings, and signed statements. I am not planning a massacre. I am building a case. I told you I want to go legitimate. That means seeking justice through the law, not just vengeance in the streets. He looked at the paper crane Lila had made him, which sat proudly on his desk. Your daughter saved my life because she believed I was worth saving, he said softly. I want to be the kind of man who actually deserves that gift. I am fighting for your mother in Ghana and for Lila's future, just as much as I am fighting for my own." Grace looked at the files and then at the man. For the first time, she saw that his strength wasn't in his anger, but in his choice to change. He was risking everything he owned to prove that Lila's kindness hadn't been wasted on a monster. The night air was cool, but Grace felt as though she were standing in a furnace. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a sound that usually meant a sweet message from home. But when she swiped the screen, her world collapsed. It was a video call from Accra. Her mother, looking tiny and frail in her favorite armchair, was surrounded by 3 men in dark suits. One held a heavy black pistol near her shoulder. The connection was clear enough for Grace to see the tears on her mother's wrinkled face. The girl and the witness for the old woman's life. A voice hissed through the speaker. "You have 12 hours. If you tell the dragon, she dies." The screen went black, leaving Grace alone in the dark garden. Everything she had done for 7 years, every floor she scrubbed, every insult she took, every night she spent away from her home, was for her mother. Her mother was her North Star. But now, the shadow of Ji-hoon had reached across the world to grab it. Grace felt her knees hit the soft dirt near the persimmon tree. She shattered. How could a mother choose between the woman who gave her life and the daughter who was her entire life? The choice was impossible. It was a jagged knife through her heart. Taesung found her there minutes later. He didn't say a word at first. He just stood by the wooden porch, his shadow long and protective. He had seen the call logs. He already knew. He walked over and sat on the ground next to her, ignoring his expensive suit. "I will trade myself," Taesung said. His voice was flat, as if he were talking about the weather. "I will go to Ji-hoon. Your mother for me. He wants me dead anyway. If he has me, he has no reason to hurt an old woman in Ghana or a child in Seoul." Grace looked at him through her tears, her voice a broken whisper. "You would die for us? You barely know us." Taesung looked at his tattooed hands. Then back at the house where Lila was sleeping. "Your daughter saved me for a reason," he said softly. "I have spent my life taking things from people. Maybe this is my chance to finally give something back. Maybe this is why I am still alive." "No." They both turned. Lila was standing in the doorway of the hammock, rubbing her eyes. She had been listening, her small face pale in the moonlight. She walked toward them and took Taesung's large hand in her tiny one. She looked at Grace with a strength that didn't belong to a 6-year-old. "We don't leave people behind, Mama," Lila said with devastating clarity. "You told me that when we left the apartment. You said we stay together. And Mr. Taesung is our people now." The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. Grace looked at the powerful criminal who was willing to die for her, and then at her brave daughter who refused to let him. In that moment, the labels disappeared. There was no longer a mafia boss, a maid, or a witness. There were only 3 people bound together by a choice. They were not a family by blood, but they were a family by heart. Grace stood up and wiped her eyes, her fear turning into a cold, hard flame. They would save her mother, but they would do it together. The plan was built on a single truth. Powerful men never really look at people they think are beneath them. To Ji-hoon, Grace was just a maid who could be ignored, and Lila was just a child who didn't understand grown-up talk. Taesung spent the next few hours coordinating his loyal teams across 2 continents. While he handled the tactical details, Grace prepared for the performance of her life. She had spent years being invisible. Now, she would use that invisibility as a weapon. The meeting was set at a modern art gallery in the heart of the city. It was a public place, filled with witnesses and bright lights. But the negotiation would happen in a soundproof private room in the back. Taesung walked in first, his face a mask of defeat. Behind him followed Grace, her shoulders slumped and her eyes red from crying. She looked exactly like a broken mother who would do anything to save her family. Lila walked beside her, clutching a small doll and wearing a sparkly pink princess bracelet. Ji-hoon didn't even glance at the jewelry, not realizing it held a tiny high-tech microphone. Ji-hoon was already there, surrounded by his conspirators. He looked polished and confident, leaning back in a leather chair. He smiled when he saw them, a cold look of victory in his eyes. He didn't know that thousands of miles away, Taesung's men were already moving into a small house in Accra to extract Grace's mother. He thought he had already won. You should have just stayed in the shadows, Taesung. Ji-hoon gloated, his voice echoing in the quiet room. You were always too trusting. Did you really think I'd let you turn our empire into a flower shop? The cyanide in your soup was a kindness. You would have died at your own table, surrounded by your luxury. Grace felt a shiver of ice go down her spine, but she stayed quiet, keeping her head down. She watched through the corner of her eye as the recorders picked up every word. Lila stepped forward then, her small shoes clicking on the polished floor. She looked up at Ji-hoon with wide, watery eyes. Why did you want to hurt my friend? Lila asked. Her voice was small and filled with a heartbreaking simplicity that cut through the tension of the room. Friends are supposed to be nice. Friends don't hurt friends. The question seemed to catch Ji-hoon off guard. He wasn't prepared for a child's innocent grief. For a second, his smug expression cracked. He looked at the little girl, and instead of seeing an obstacle, he saw the person who had ruined his perfect plan. Your friend was weak, he snapped, his anger finally making him reckless. I did what was necessary to take what was mine. The poison, the threats. It was all for the organization. He didn't deserve that seat. Every word of his confession was captured. The trap had snapped shut. Grace stood up straight then, the broken mother vanishing. She looked Ji-hoon directly in the eye, her voice no longer a whisper. You thought I was just a maid, Grace said, her words steady and sharp. You thought I was just a help, invisible. But I have spent my life watching men like you. I see everything, and I remember everything. For the first time, Ji-hoon looked at Grace and felt a flicker of real fear. He had ignored the shadow for too long, and now the shadow was the one holding the light. The moment the art gallery doors opened, the world shifted. Taesung didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he pressed a button on his phone. In an instant, the recording of Ji-hoon's confession was sent to dozens of people at once. It landed on the desks of honest police officers, hungry news reporters, and the members of Taesung's organization who still believed in loyalty. The secret was out. The conspirators tried to call for help, but their protection had vanished like smoke in the wind. No one wanted to be on the side of a man caught on tape bragging about poison. At the very same time, thousands of miles away in Accra, a different kind of battle was being won. Taesung's private team, working with the local authorities and Interpol, burst into the house where Grace's mother was being held. The men in dark suits were arrested before they could even draw their guns. Grace's mother was gently lifted into a high-tech medical plane that Taesung had already paid for. She was safe, and she was on her way to Seoul. Inside the gallery, the police moved in. Ji-hoon was led away in handcuffs, his face twisted in a silent scream of rage. He had expected a bloody fight, but Taesung had given him something much worse. A day in court. Taesung stood tall, watching his old partner be taken away. He had kept his word. He was seeking justice, not just more blood. He was finally breaking the cycle his father had started, but the victory came with a heavy price. As the news of Taesung's cooperation with the law spread, his empire began to break apart. Many of his men, who only cared about power and money, walked away. They didn't want to work for a clean boss. Taesung lost buildings, he lost territory, and he lost a fear that had always kept his enemies at a distance. In the eyes of the criminal world, he had become weak. A week later, Grace found Taesung standing on the porch of the Hanok. He looked tired, and the weight of his losses seemed to hang heavy on his shoulders. He was no longer the king of the city, just a man with a smaller, quieter business. Grace looked out into the courtyard where Lila was running under a persimmon tree. She was playing with the children of the few guards who had stayed loyal to Taesung. Her laughter was bright and free, a sound that hadn't been heard in a long time. Grace walked up to him, her voice soft in the evening air. You lost so much to save us, she said. Was it worth it? Taesung didn't answer right away. He watched Lila trip, laugh, and get back up again. He looked at his hands that were now working to build something honest instead of something stolen. He saw the child who had looked at his tattoos and saw pretty drawings instead of monster. Yes, Taesung said, his voice firm and sure. Grace watched him and realized that she had witnessed a miracle. Taesung had transformed himself. He had chosen to be a better man, not because it was easy, but because a little girl had believed he could be. He had traded a dark, powerful empire for a smaller, cleaner life, and for the first time, he looked truly at peace. Grace realized that while she had been looking for a way to save her family, they had all ended up saving each other. 6 months later, the cold monsoon rains had been replaced by the soft pink petals of cherry blossoms floating through the Seoul air. Grace stood in the bright, modern lobby of a hospital, holding a bouquet of flowers. Upstairs, her mother was sitting up in bed, her strength returning a little more each day. The hospital bills were always paid on time by an anonymous donor, though Grace knew exactly whose tattooed hands had signed the checks. Her mother was finally stable enough to fly back to Ghana, but she had decided to stay. She wanted to be there to see Lila grow up, and for the first time in her life, Grace didn't have to worry about how they would afford the extra room. Lila was thriving in a way Grace had only ever dreamed of. She attended a prestigious international school where her curiosity was celebrated instead of ignored. She spoke Korean fluently now, her voice ringing out in the hallways as she taught her classmates the Ghanaian songs Grace used to sing to her in the dark. She was still the same Lila, asking bold questions with her trademark directness. During a school play, she had looked at a teacher and asked, "Why do people stay sad when they can just choose to be kind?" The room had gone silent, just like the penthouse dinner, but this time, people clapped instead of shaking with fear. Grace's life had transformed as well. She no longer moved through the world like an invisible ghost. She worked in the office of Taesung's new legal import business, managing logistics and trade. She had a real contract, a legal work visa, and a salary that allowed her to look at a menu without doing math in her head. Most importantly, she had respect. During a meeting last week, a senior manager had called her Grace, using the flat English pronunciation. Grace had paused, straightened her posture, and looked him in the eye. "It is pronounced GRHC, she said firmly. The manager had blinked in surprise, then bowed slightly and apologized. He got it right the next time. She was finally visible. Taesung's world was smaller now, but it was much brighter. The transition to a legal business was hard, and there were still moments when the shadows of his past tried to pull him back. Some old contacts still called, and some old habits were hard to break. But his path was clear. He was no longer a king of a criminal empire. He was a man building something he could be proud of. On a quiet Friday afternoon, Grace stopped by his office to drop off some files. Taesung was looking out the window at the city skyline, but he turned and smiled when she entered. Grace noticed the 3 framed photos sitting on his desk. The first was of his mother, a woman who had died too young in a world of violence. The second was of his father, the man who had built an empire on blood and secrets. And the third, placed right in the center, was a photo of Lila in her pink princess dress, holding a paper crane. Taesung didn't need to say anything. The photos told the whole story. He had moved away from the blood of his father and toward the truth of a child. Grace realized that they were all finally free. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. As she walked out of the office and into the golden afternoon light, Grace realized that the little girl who had once screamed, Mister, hadn't just saved a man's life. She had saved all of them.